Thank you, Sarah and Paul and everyone else for organizing and attending this. It's really exciting for me because this notion of planetary intelligence it's an idea I've been fond of and a phrase I've used for a little while, but I wasn't really sure if anyone else was resonating with it or thinking about it. And then when Sarah and Paul approached me and said, well, let's have a symposium on planetary intelligence, I was just thrilled. But I also thought, well, it's kind of weird. We didn't really talk about what we mean by planetary intelligence. We're just going to get together and have a symposium. So we're going to show up and maybe I'll say what we mean, and maybe we're talking about the same thing, maybe not. But that was also intriguing to me. But in our discussions last night, and so far, it seems as though even if we're not meaning exactly the same thing, there's enough overlap to allow us to have some fruitful discussions around this perhaps nebulous, but maybe nebulous concept that we can maybe concretize a little bit, and maybe that's partly why we're here. I noticed a couple of years ago on Twitter, somebody posted this, that the world is failing badly at its climate goals. Yearly greenhouse gas emissions keep rising. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, well, it's an interesting way to phrase it. What does it mean for a planet to have goals? It doesn't say, people are failing at their planet goals or we're failing at our planet goals. It says the world is failing at its climate goals. And so, it may just be semantics here, but this is a way we often find ourselves speaking or hear other people speaking. And maybe it is just semantics, or maybe it is possible for a world, for a planet, to have goals. It's kind of a fun thing to think about. When I saw this poster, in addition to being thrilled about the fact that we were going to have a planetary intelligence symposium, I also thought at first, isn't there a typo or a grammatical error here? Because shouldn't it be humanity with a Y apostrophe S, the possessive of humanity's future in the age of AI? And then I thought, though, after looking at it for a little while, I thought, no, actually, I like it this way because it implies plural humanities and the possessive. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, and I don't really care. But I've actually decided, I'm not saying this to be snarky, although it is kind of fun, but I actually have come around to thinking this is correct because the implication is that it guards against thinking of ourselves in this simplistic way as this unitary, as one thing, when we are clearly many. One of the critiques of the Anthropocene from the standpoint of critical theory and humanities and environmental ethics and so forth is that we often use what people call species talk, and in this simplistic way say, what are we going to do about the fact that we have messed up the planet of the Earth, and how are we going to solve this problem? And people step back and say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by we? Because there are all these issues of environmental justice where people from the industrialized countries have caused this problem, and people from poor countries are suffering, are more vulnerable potentially to some of the changes. And if you just talk about everything on the species level or the global civilization level, aren't you glossing over some of these tricky issues? And that's a really valid and interesting challenge to Anthropocene thinking. I think there are valid responses to it. And I don't think it invalidates at all the notion of the Anthropocene, but I think it's something that we have to incorporate and respond to the way we discuss it. So in light of that, I very much like thinking of this as humanity's plural future in the age of AI. Anyways, so the Anthropocene, there are many ways to describe it and think about it. One way is that we can, it's challenging in that it represents a merging of these different ways we think of time, of geological time and biological time and human historical time. There's a way in which they have become conjoined, and perhaps irreversibly. It may be that there will be no more human history separate from geology and vice versa. There may be. It depends on how things go. But it really does challenge our way of thinking about sort of all of these narratives that we've often thought about as separate and occurring on separate timescales when we have to think of them as entwined together. As far as the value for astrobiology of Anthropocene thinking, it does a lot of things for us. It sort of alters the baseline from which we study comparative planetology. Earth is implicitly the standard of comparison that we use for other planets, but then we have to realize that baseline is perturbed in this very unusual way. So that, assuming that Earth is the null planet is not necessarily logically safe. It certainly involves the forces that may well dominate the future of habitability on Earth, not just for humans, but potentially for the entire biosphere. And it arguably marks a branching point in planetary history, one which may have analogs elsewhere in the galaxy. And this notion that we could abstract the essence of this transformation on Earth in such a way that is applicable beyond Earth is very interesting for SETI and thinking about exoplanets, but also I think is valuable for then thinking about ourselves and our own situation here and our own future from the perspective that this more abstracted perspective that we can attempt to have provides. Oh, there's Pluto. Pluto belongs in the family portrait. It's always feeling left out, but no, you're welcome, Pluto. You can join the picture. All right. The question that I am drawn to ask, and this is, I don't know if, I know some of you were at my talk last night, I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, but in thinking about life as a planetary property, as Sarah so eloquently discussed this morning, I am drawn to thinking of the possibility that intelligence like life could be or could become a planetary property. That is not just something that's incidentally happening on a planet, but something that becomes deeply embedded into the cyclic flows of matter and energy that define the way planets operate. And I think there's even one way to look at our current struggles environmentally and in a sense geopolitically as framed by this question. Is it possible to, in a sustainable way, develop our technological civilization or civilizations along such a path so that we can become deeply integrated into planetary functioning rather than, in a sense, working with the planet rather than ignoring it or working against it. And I'm going to mention this quickly because, again, I don't want to repeat myself from last night, but I've tried to categorize the different modes of biological interaction with the planet into sort of major categories of change. And there are two that I want to focus on here. The difference between both of these involve cognitive processes interacting with a planetary system, but what I call planetary changes of the third kind are inadvertent changes where technological entities, beings, species are altering their environment without any awareness that they're having global effects. And I would submit that this would often be the path of a technological species because there's a way in which your activities will start out local and the world will seem infinite when you haven't greatly populated, and it will be sort of natural to have this inadvertent phase before the realization that one is a global entity and the necessity of moving to this intentional phase in order to maintain a healthy biosphere. And yeah, I mentioned obvious examples of inadvertent planetary changes, global warming, ozone, and examples of intentional change. Again, ozone, because it is one global problem that we realized we were inducing and found ways to face and at least credibly begin to solve. So it serves as sort of a proof of concept that there is this potential mode of intentional interaction with the biosphere. And other examples of this, in addition to ozone replenishment, would be the intentional, I don't see red very well. The intentional halting or reversal of industrial global warming, planetary defense against asteroids, geoengineering is controversial, but certainly fits into this, mode. It would be intentional interacting with planetary biosphere. And there's a lot of ways to think about geoengineering. I submit that when we plant trees, if we're planting trees because we want to affect the carbon cycle in a certain way, then we're doing a kind of geoengineering. So in this category, I put all intentional interventions into the planetary cycle. Obviously, there's a big difference between that and squirting stuff into the stratosphere and hoping that we don't destroy the monsoons in Asia as we cool the planet. So there's a wide spectrum of activities we could put in geoengineering. Certainly the terraforming of Mars and other planets goes into this category of intentionally interacting with a planetary climate system. And in that sense, even though people ask me what I think about terraforming Mars, I say, well, if somebody told me they were going to start next week, I would strenuously object and protest, hold up a sign at the launch pad saying, no, we can't do that. But the fact that people are modeling terraforming of Mars, I find to be very valuable as an exercise, because it's a way of flexing our intellectual muscles and thinking, how would we intentionally interact with a planetary climate as opposed to inadvertently messing with one? What are the leverage points, and what are the most effective ways if one wanted to have some level of conscious interaction with a planetary system? So the intellectual exercise of terraforming helps us out in that way. In the somewhat longer run, interfering with the ice age cycle to prevent dangerous natural climate changes, and in the very long run, the mitigation of the eventual inevitable runaway greenhouse that will happen on Earth as the sun ages. Now we're talking, a billion or more years in the future, so it gets pretty abstract. But my point, this is all on sort of a spectrum of levels of interaction and time scale once we start to think of ourselves as entities who could choose to intervene in the functioning of a planet in different ways. And if we wanted to get nerdy about it, we could even plot this on a log time scale and say, there's categories, certain problems are solved. The smallpox vaccine is a good example of a global intervention in a terrible problem that has basically been solved. Ozone is on track. Global warming, at least we're aware of the problem. There's an effort underway. It's very fraught, and it's questionable whether, it's obvious we're not acting fast enough, but we are acting. There's, it's got the world's attention now. Other things at least being modeled, and you can try to assign them to time scales, or geoengineering, planetary defense, terraforming, intervening with ice ages, and then if you go way out to the billion-year time scale, we'll have to do something. If we or someone else or our machine descendants or anyone is still around, they'll have to deal with eventually with the problem of solar evolution on a very long time scale. So if I look at these categories of planetary change, where else in the universe will they occur? I think natural disasters will occur on all planets. Any place interesting enough to have life will have the kind of physical transformations that also occasionally lead to natural disasters, not to mention that asteroid impacts are going to be ubiquitous. Biologically induced catastrophes, like the oxygen catastrophe in Earth history, I think will occur on all planets with life. Because what does life do? We can argue about what life is, but we can agree on some of its properties. Life multiplies and alters its environment, and I think that alone will occasionally lead to the evolution of environmental changes, which will be catastrophic for other life. And then we can ask these two kinds of cognitive changes, inadvertent and intentional. Are they unique to Earth, or are they something that can be abstracted? And of course, then we get into the question of SETI. Are we alone, or is this some kind of a common story? And with SETI, there's a gateway there to thinking about our far future. SETI is all about longevity, and it's one of the advantages of SETI thinking is it helps us reflect back on ourselves and think about how we fit into cosmic evolution and what the potential for longevity of civilizations and even of our so-called civilization may be. And when we think about that, we have to deal with something that several very smart people have referred to as a kind of 21st century bottleneck. And I'm referring here to Martin Rees, who wrote this book, Our Final Hour. Somewhat pessimistic, depending on how you look at it, he gives us 50-50 chance of making it through the 21st century. Now, he wrote this book at the beginning of the 20th century. Now we've made it through 18%, so I don't know. Right, so I'm going to have to read it to see if that changes his odds there. Yeah. Slightly more, excellent. So okay, so yes, I'm heartened. E.O. Wilson also talks about, they both talk about this idea of a bottleneck. The idea being that there's this, right now, this sort of accelerating series of challenges, some of which are listed here, which left to our current trajectory are arguably not compatible with long-term survival. And that's what leads to the potential pessimism here. Nonetheless, the fact that we can see these things coming and talk about them and start to take corrective action differentiates us from something like a virus or a bacteria that's just going to grow in its petri dish until it crashes. The power of foresight gives us some possibility of navigating this bottleneck. And also the reason why it's conceived as a bottleneck is because there's this notion, and I tried to capture this with my fourth kind of planetary change, that a lot of these technological abilities and developing capabilities can also potentially be a source of great longevity. That if you gain control over natural disasters in many ways, that there's at least a gateway there to, if you get over our current inability to coherently control ourselves, that there's at least a possible other path of evolution where these technological capabilities enhance longevity. And so the bottleneck may be very narrow, but the notion is that there's potentially another end where you've solved some of these problems and you, in fact, emerge from that bottleneck as an entity with potential for great longevity. Oh, in addition to all those problems, there's the possibility of the zombie apocalypse. So, we really have a lot to deal with right now. But this notion of a bottleneck leads to the possibility of a bifurcation in lifetime of civilizations, if that bottleneck is, in fact, a feature of young, developing technological civilizations. And so it may be that most civilizations are short-lived, and that maybe often technological prowess is not adaptive. Maybe the bottleneck is very narrow and it's hard to make it through. But if some can make it through, even a very tiny percentage, and become this sort of sustainable technological global civilizations, they may become what I call quasi-immortal. You can imagine a transition to extremely great longevity, which involves a deep understanding of nature, deep self-understanding, ability to foretell natural disasters, and maybe ultimately spread beyond one solar system to make a civilization invulnerable to even very large-scale astrophysical calamities. And even if most civilizations at our stage are doomed to self-destruct, it's possible that some small fraction could make that transition. And what are the consequences of that? And again, I don't want to get too much into all this, but a lot of you have heard of the Drake equation, where L is the longevity of civilizations. And the Drake equation is generally conceived of as a steady state equation, where there's a rate of creation and a rate of death of civilizations. But if you can have quasi-immortality, then that's actually wrong, that there is no meaningful L. There's no average lifetime if it's a transition to, to just more or less immortal life. I say quasi-immortality because the universe is probably not going to last forever, but it's, there's a song by one of my favorite bands called, the band is NRBQ, and they have a song that's called Immortal for a While. And that's I guess, quasi-immortality, long enough to change the math here. And so it may be that the fledgling civilizations have some spread of lifetimes, and most of them don't make it, and that's how we normally think of L. But there's this other hump you can get over to where you sort of last as long as the universe lasts, or for some cosmological lifespan. And that changes the picture a little bit in some interesting ways. For one thing, it means that the human prospect is not closely linked to the likely abundance of long-lived civilizations. We usually think, oh, if L is large, then we have a prospect of living a long time and we have the prospect of meeting others. But it may be that we're here, but there still are these long-lived immortal civilizations, or as Franz Kafka put it, there is an infinite amount of hope in the universe, but not for us. I don't necessarily believe that, but that's one of the interesting implications if you start to explore the consequences of this picture of civilizations in the galaxy. At any rate, for the purposes of this discussion here, I'm thinking about equating this state with the notion of planetary intelligence, that there's a sort of maybe proto-intelligence that is reached by these civilizations who don't necessarily gain you could call it wisdom, you could call it the ability to have some kind of global coherence, to work with themselves rather than against themselves or against their planet. You could call that proto-intelligence, and then the transition maybe to a different kind of entity, which I have written about and called true intelligence or planetary intelligence. There's also, you can think of a kind of definition of intelligence here, where especially when we're thinking about searching for intelligent life elsewhere, we tend to think of looking for radio telescopes, that if you can develop a radio telescope, then you're an intelligent species. And the joke is this definition of intelligence was invented by radio astronomers, right? But it's practical, right? It gives you something to search for. But you could also say that, when you do the math of SETI, it's going to be very hard to find anybody if they're not a long-lived civilization. And so then that may imply a different way of thinking about intelligence. That again, we might have a sort of proto-intelligence, but that if you get through that bottleneck to a state where technology and societal organization are clearly able to facilitate long-term survival, then that is one definition of a truly intelligent civilization. And it sort of makes sense in the sense that, it's how intelligent is it to build a civilization and then wipe yourself out, and it's you could argue that's kind of dumb. So it's not enough to be able to build a radio telescope. You need to be able to broadcast or listen for centuries, and that implies an ability to live with oneself and live with powerful technology for a long enough time to have made this kind of transition. So maybe proto-intelligence is to technological civilization as life is to a biosphere. And we had some interesting discussions about this yesterday, which I think we'll come back to, whether you can have life without a biosphere. But it could be that life is a prerequisite that may or may not become a biosphere, and it could be that proto-intelligence of the kind that we presumably have now is a prerequisite that may not become a robust, sustainable global entity. And this is the cartoon that my friend John Lomberg drew of the way the habitable zone might be shaped for civilizations that attain some level of intelligence, but not planetary intelligence. This got cut off at the top, but we mentioned a little bit last night. We're talking about the Anthropocene and when it starts, and there's all these different ideas about when in the geological history you would date the start of the Anthropocene. I suggested that we could look at this strata as the key, but regardless of what place on the rock, on whatever planet you place the beginning of the Anthropocene, there's a mechanistic quality to the beginning of the Anthropocene that we can discuss. And another way to phrase this, and I think this is a worthwhile way of thinking, is that the true Anthropocene begins with the end of our innocence, with a mass awareness of our role as world changers. That is, there's a phase in which we're changing the world, but are not really aware of it. And that, in a certain sense, you could call the Anthropocene because we become a global force. But I refer to that sometimes as the proto-Anthropocene, where we're unconscious world changers. And what really makes this phase potentially very different is that we have growing knowledge of what we're doing to this planet, and that knowledge empowers us to change trajectory. And so we could define a new phase, which I call the mature Anthropocene, dominated by these intentional changes, changes of the fourth kind, where there's a feedback between the awareness and the global actions. So that awareness of your global activities and the global changes you are inducing feeds back into your that awareness feeds back and affects, changes your behavior. You change your behavior in such a way that's informed by the perception of those changes. Now, we can talk about what intelligence is. I hope we will. But it seems to me that one of its properties is sensing changes in the world and responding to avoid dangers and seek opportunities. And if that's true, then this boundary is the beginning of a certain kind of intelligence that didn't exist here. And that's, I guess, my point about planetary intelligence. So self-aware global change, I think, is a completely new phenomenon. And that gives me a more hopeful way of thinking about the Anthropocene, because if we define it this way, then the Anthropocene is actually something to aspire to. Instead of fearing and saying, oh my God, let's end it right now, you can say, bring it on. Let's do this. Let's act with self-awareness and try to begin this phase. And in that sense, the Anthropocene is just getting started with discussions like this. So we can talk then about cognitive planetary transitions, just as we can talk about biological transitions. And maybe it's useful to think of technological intelligence as not merely the appearance of a certain kind of civilization, but as a potential change stage in planetary evolution. And this is where I've talked about the Sapiezoic eon, that the Anthropocene is not merely a new epoch. And you notice you can't really see here, if you read the fine print in the book, I've differentiated between Proto-Anthropocene and mature Anthropocene here. And the Proto-Anthropocene is still in the Phanerozoic, but the mature Anthropocene is the first epoch potentially in what I call the Sapiezoic eon, the phase of Earth history where a transition has occurred to where cognitive properties are in some deep, sustained way embedded into the global biogeochemical, physical cycles that determine the behavior of a planet. So that's the idea of the Sapiezoic eon. And of course, if it's really going to be an eon, eons are long periods of time. We won't even know if we're in a new eon for millions of years. So this is very much an aspirational notion, because it requires that the cognitive processes become a long-term stable part of planetary functioning, which certainly implies a very different behavioral mode than we can see exhibited by so-called intelligent life now. And from a systems perspective, you would almost expect the early stages of this transition to be highly unstable, because global influence precedes and exceeds global control. That's what I mean by those changes of the third kind. And therefore, you're going to have unstable positive feedbacks. But when global influence is incorporated into the behavior that leads to that influence and moderates it, that awareness leads to negative feedbacks, which moderate that behavior. And that's another way, I think, of sort of formulating our challenge, as you will, of facing the future as technological, as creatures with world-changing technology. So I just want to now refer back to the first few times I used this phrase, planetary intelligence, and sort of just, again, clarify what I meant when I first used it, because, again, I'm thrilled now that we're here and we're talking about it. So when I first used it, here's what I wrote, and this is in Earth in Human Hands, that we could consider classifying intelligence by the effect it has on planetary evolution. There is a kind of cognitive activity that results in rampant, unchecked, unplanned global change of the kind we're seeing today. And there is another level, what we might call true intelligence or planetary intelligence, of more globally coordinated cognitive activity that can result in more stabilizing behavior. And this is that piece I wrote in Slate that Sarah mentioned, and this was in, I guess, 2013. And I related to the Gaia hypothesis. Just as Gaia defines life as an inherent planetary property, we could conceive of planetary intelligence, a global attribute that develops far beyond our current chaotic, self-conflicted stage and becomes a long-term stabilizing influence on a planet. And then at the end of that essay, I added, why should we consider defining intelligence as something global and as something that hasn't actually yet appeared on Earth? Well, for one thing, it might be useful for envisioning our future and any other civilizations maybe out there among the stars. It may give us something to strive for. And this is from a piece I wrote. I do these regular columns for astronomy, the competitor, Sky and Telescope magazine, for Sky and Telescope called Cosmic Relief. And this was one where I expressed somewhat similar ideas but elaborated a little bit. I said, just in the nick of time, we may be starting to develop a kind of, quote, planetary intelligence that would enable us to anticipate, perceive, and respond to survival threats on a global level. The rapidly coalescing, technologically interconnected global noosphere, coined by Thierry Chardin and Vernadsky, of trade and communication, has some properties of an emerging consciousness. As in a primitive nervous system, information is sensed and exchanged through complex networks, and the global system reacts in various ways. Through us and our technology, the biosphere is arguably developing a global mind that may soon be able to fend off asteroid strikes and climate catastrophes. Our survival may depend on refining and amplifying these tendencies. And I also realized I used this, we talk about technosignatures, I actually use nuosignatures here as another way to think about what we might be looking for elsewhere. So, but this captures another question that I think the notion of planetary intelligence raises. There's a question of, or I think the concept is valuable simply in recognizing that we have planetary scale threats that are going to require planetary scale responses. And you could say anything that leads to a planetary scale response is a form of planetary intelligence. But there's also this notion that I hinted at here, and I've elaborated on a little bit more elsewhere, that perhaps planetary intelligence can also describe something that is developing a kind of global mentation, global mental activity that we are participating in but not even fully aware of. The idea that a global mind is developing through many of our activities, but that we may not be aware of it, just as just as neurons are not necessarily aware, are participating in your brain, but each neuron isn't necessarily aware of your brain. Neutrons aren't either, and they're part of your neurons, so it's neutrons all the way down. No, you know, it seems to me, when we conceive of our future, that in order to survive, we do need to become a new kind of entity on this planet, and maybe the key is the widespread propagation of a worldview that is global and multi-generational. And this is something that I actually think is happening now. And obviously there are counter-forces to this where just the opposite is happening, so it's very confusing to try to figure out the present. There are trends in multiple directions. But it seems as though the essential problem in determining whether our, quote, intelligence is to be long-lived or transient is our struggle to achieve some kind of global scale intentionality. And, am I almost out of time? Okay, great, 5 minutes. So the qualities we associate with intelligence as an individual trait would seem to be necessary but not sufficient for long-term survival with technology. So again, is it useful to think of defining intelligence as a global property? And have we been constructing and enacting a noosphere, possibly one with cognitive properties of which we are actually unaware or not fully aware? Could there be some developing global mind that we are participating in? Global networks of trade, transport, governance, information, social connectivity, movements of goods and people, even our conflicts, are kinds of connectivity. And if you think about the way brains really work, I think this becomes more plausible. I've been influenced by this concept by the great Marvin Minsky, who died recently. He wrote this book and developed a theory called Society of Mind, in which you can think of the way our brains work, the way our minds work, as consisting of all of these different agents and component parts that are interacting in complex ways. And those individual agents are not necessarily conscious themselves, and yet out of the interactions of all those parts comes some experience some phenomena of consciousness. And it occurs to me, if we can talk about the society of mind, then we might also flip that around and talk about the mind of society. That when you think of a mind as somebody like Marvin Minsky described it, with all this, if you could actually descend into your mind while you're trying to make up your mind, you would sense all these conflicting thoughts and impulses, and it wouldn't necessarily seem like a coherent process. Maybe it would in fact seem like our current political process today seems to us very incoherent and frustratingly not going anywhere. But yet out of that chaotic activity, a thought, an action emerges. And so I think it's conceivable that we could talk about the mind of society. Just another couple of quick quotes from things I've written before that I feel like touch on this. This is from Earth in Human Hands, and I talked about the growing satellite sensing of Earth. And I said, it is if Earth has been evolving a diffuse new organ, a sky-high mycelium of floating mechanical sensors growing far above its surface. We've shrouded our world with thousands of satellites monitoring our planet, spotting previously hidden global patterns, and constantly firing instantaneous signals around the globe, like cells in a restless planetary superbrain. With these compound orbital eyes and the self-assembling cyborg mind, we perceive with new depth and acuity that we are deeply embedded in complex global cycles and systems of matter, energy, and information. Augmented by satellite senses and terabyte memories, our cave-evolved intellects, supersized with supercomputers, is just now attaining vast new abilities to comprehend the non-local present and to model and anticipate the future. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we do have time for a couple questions.
Hi, nice talk. People talk about this idea of preserving the Earth or preserving the biosphere. You mentioned earlier in your talk, you used the phrase to maintain a healthy biosphere. And my question is for whom?
Yeah.
Because you can talk about maintaining a healthy biosphere for individual humans, for the human population. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, great question. And of course, there's a lot that's been glossed over here, and that's one good point. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying that we're not really talking about saving the Earth here. The Earth is going to be fine, after it sneezes us off, if that's what it does, and continues on, and there'll be this little, extinction event that happened, and a layer of, manhole covers and Twinkie wrappers, and then life will go on. If, that's one possible outcome. At any rate, the Earth itself is not threatened by us. The current biosphere is stressed by us, but really the most fragile part of that, in a sense, is our own civilization. So, I mean, there's other fragile parts of the coral reefs that, I'm worried about them. But, the coral reefs have gone away many times and come back. And so, as far as enduring properties of the biosphere, there's really nothing to be worried about from the Earth's perspective, but our own fragility and the seeming inconsistency of that and the what we're putting the biosphere through, the global climate through, is cause of concern for us. So when I say maintaining a biosphere within healthy conditions, there is a certain self-centered view of that, except I think in the longer run, in my conception, that also includes avoiding mass extinctions. And so if we avoid asteroid impacts and avoid ice ages in the future, we're not only, it's not just selfish in the sense that that's just for human beings, but that we would prevent a lot of other extinction. And I think in the long run, if we go down this road of planetary intelligence, we have the potential to save a lot more species in the future than are currently threatened by our activities. We could even, it seems arrogant to say, but we could ultimately be the best thing that ever happened to Earth. We could prevent future mass extinctions. That if we succeed to that level, by the way, it creates new problems. What is the desired rate of extinction? If we get to that point where we have control on ourselves, do you want the extinction rate to go down to 0? that would be a huge intervention in the evolution of life that has never occurred before. So if we actually get good at this, we're going to have other conceptual challenges about what's really the right way to manage this place. But first of all, we have to, the emergency is getting over our current sort of climate vandalism and like creating a safe place for us to live and solve these other problems.
So we are out of time for questions on this session, but we have a coffee break now. So if you have more questions, I'm sure you can find David for the coffee break. So thank you so much. We're going to resume in 20 minutes.